Greetings and welcome to the Art of Tumbao, a podcast dedicated to helping dancers unlock the deeper aspects of Afro-Latin social dance. My name is Musa with Social Dance Mastery, and today I'm so excited. This episode, I'm going to take you on a journey that traverses centuries, culture. It's a journey about one of the most essential Afro-Latin instruments, the Conga drum. And this is not just a story about a drum. This is a story about resilience, transformation, evolution, and it's the story about a rhythm that pulses through every salsa song that you've ever danced to. So let's dive deep into the origins of the Conga Tumbao. To really understand the Conga drum, right, we have to go way back. We have to go back to the central region of Africa, the most green part of the continent, which lies directly in the heart of the Congo. This is the heart of Africa, the heart of the continent. And if you look at any map of Africa that shows you the wetness and dryness, you can see this, how the top of Africa is very dry, desert. The bottom of Africa is very dry, but the greenest parts are in the center, and the most greenest part is right in the center of the continent. And what's here is the Congo. And when it comes to the Afro diaspora, when it comes to what happened with the transatlantic slave trade, we do know that the majority of the enslaved people that were brought to all these places in the Americas, places like Brazil, places like Puerto Rico, places like Colombia, places like Cuba, the majority of these people were coming directly from the Congo, whether it's the drums in bomba in Puerto Rico, right? Or whether it's the drums used in cumbia in Colombia, the drums used in samba in Brazil. But when it comes to the Conga drum specifically, we really have to look at Cuba, because in Cuba, the name that this drum was actually called in the context that it was developed in Cuba, it was called the tumbadora. And it has direct ancestors. The direct ancestors of this drum can be traced back to that central forest region of the Congo, the Bantu region within the continent of Africa. We look at these drums, and when we trace them back to some of the Congolese drums that were being used, like the makuta and the yuca drums of the Congo, we can really see the similarities. If you take a picture of the makuta and the yuca drums, if you take a picture of what we now know as the Conga drums, you can see the similarities very clearly. And this is how we get into understanding the roots of the Conga Tumbao, because the roots of the Conga Tumbao come out of that African drum culture, which was highly sophisticated despite the popular belief that drums are a very primitive instrument. But that's not the case, actually, because drums weren't just used for rhythms, right? Drums were used as a form of communication. Drums were used as a way to connect with the higher realms. The way that the rhythms would intersect in one of the main African musical theoretical concepts called polyrhythm, which is the interlocking of different rhythmic cells creating a pulse that really can change the environment of a space. This is what happens when drums are in a space. You can feel the vibration change. You can feel that it's doing something to you. But now, the unthinkable happens, right? The transatlantic slave trade, uprooting a lot of the Congolese people, uprooting a lot of people also from Nigeria and other countries along the coastal regions in the Horn of Africa. You can see that when these people were transplanted across the Atlantic, They weren't allowed to bring anything with them. They weren't allowed to bring their drums. They weren't allowed to practice their traditions, their spirituality. But the one thing that was able to survive this horrific journey were these rhythms. And the rhythms were like stowaways hidden within the bodies, the minds, the spirits, the bones of the enslaved people. And they were preserved. So by the time that we get to the Conga drum as we know it today, right, we can see that the rhythms that this drum is producing is directly reflecting where they came from across the water, all the way back into the heart of Africa. So we're gonna focus in on Cuba because Cuba is where this drum was developed. The Conga drum is specifically a Cuban invention. Even though it has African roots, this drum, this specific style, this specific version of drum is developed specifically in Cuba. And there are other drums in Cuba too that we'll talk about in other episodes, such as the bata and the bembe drums, which have more an influence from the Yoruba in the Nigerian region of Africa. But when it comes to the conga, we're talking specifically about that central Congo area, the Bantu region of Africa. The story of these conga drums is very unique because prior to 1886, these drums were heavily persecuted. These drums were even banned in most places because of what they represented, because of the threat that they posed to the colonial establishment at that time, because they knew the power of these drums, right? Which is why it was hard to find these type of drums within the modern musical ensembles of that colonial era in Cuba, in dances such as the contradanza and the danzón. You were scarce to find drums played in the manner and in the style that they were played in say Central and Western Africa. The only time you would really find these drums is during special occasions such as the carnivales and places like Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and different types of comparsas, which were sort of like street parades that would happen where people from the cabildos, which were some of the African nation houses within Cuba, would have one day in the year where they can parade with their instruments and their traditional attire. And this is why that was allowed. But other than that, a lot of these drums were highly persecuted and pretty much banned. And it wasn't until the abolition of slavery in 1886 in Cuba where things started to open up. There started to be more of a cultural explosion, and drums more and more started to find their way into some of the ensembles at that time. And right after 1886, one of the main musical genres that started to include some more of the African aesthetics of musical interpretation was the rumba. And because the drums were still heavily persecuted, they didn't have any drums, they weren't able to really practice, drums were banned still. So what they did was, in the rumba, they found whatever they could find to make those rhythms, whether it be wooden boxes that they call cajones. These became instruments. They would use spoons. They would use many different types of instruments to create rumba. The early conga drums took shape within what we know as the rumba. And if you listen closely to rumba music, that traditional Cuban rumba, you can hear the structure of what would eventually become the tumbao rhythm. If you listen to the guaguancó, if you listen to the guaguancó, you can hear that tumbao coming out. You can hear that they're using the African music aesthetics of polyrhythm, of key rhythms, the clave rhythm. All of these are African musical concepts that would eventually evolve into what we know as the Conga Tumbao, or that Conga rhythm that became so popularized in many places of the world and in a lot of different types of music, and started to become incorporated into so many types of music, even until rock. We can hear that Conga Tumbao. Over time, this rhythm evolved and it became the heartbeat of Cuban dance music. All right, so now let's talk about the tumbao, because if you've ever danced salsa, then you felt the tumbao. Even if you didn't know what the name was, even if you didn't know it was a concept, the tumbao is there. And if you dance to salsa music, if you let salsa music move you, then you were moved by this rhythm called the tumbao, specifically the Conga tumbao. This is the rolling, hypnotic, repetitive pattern played on the Conga drum that makes this salsa music feel alive. It's what gives the pulse to this music, right? The Conga tumbao, along with the other instruments interlocking in their rhythmic polyrhythm, this is what makes the essence of this music. The Conga tumbao is built on a steady pulse, but it has a syncopation. And the syncopation means that it is the open tones of this rhythm that are played on the offbeats. And this is what creates that forward driving motion that moves the body naturally. Like when you hear these rhythms, you can't really help but move, even if it's moving subconsciously, tapping your foot, tapping your head, swaying your body. You know, this music creates that motion because of its syncopation. So these are two very African theoretical concepts that we're talking about right now: polyrhythm and syncopation. The Conga tumbao is in direct conversation always with the clave, and with the clave is also in direct communication with the other tumbao instruments, such as the bass tumbao, the piano montuno, the bongo, and all the other instruments. They're all moving off of this key rhythm of the clave. And this is what makes the harmony of how all these instruments can interlock within each other in a harmonious way, because it's a very interesting story of how it started to evolve. After 1886, we start to see the emergence of son in the early 1900s. Son is that Cuban music that a lot of the salsa is based on. It's based off of traditional son. And in this music, you start to see the introduction of more drums. Specifically, first one is the bongo, right? But as the son started to develop into the Son Montuno, we start to get that mambo section within the Son Montuno, and you get the introduction of the conga drums. Now, the conga drums were kept in the background. They were kept in the house. They were used only on special occasions. They weren't really brought out because even though slavery was abolished, anything related to African culture was still persecuted, was still seen as something primitive, something low, and even something demonic. So this is why you get Arsenio Rodríguez, which is one of the innovators of the son. What he did is he revolutionized how son was played. He added more instruments to the ensemble. He created what was called a conjunto, which is a big group of musicians playing this son music. And one of the main contributions that Arsenio Rodríguez did was he incorporated the conga drum, or what was called the tumbadora. And he did this with a lot of resistance. A lot of people gave him flack for bringing that instrument in, because a lot of the instruments that were used were European instruments, such as the flute, the violin, the guitar that has a lot of heavy Spanish influence, even though the guitar can be traced back to Africa as well. But these instruments were more of the colonial style of instruments, the different horns that were used, the stringed instruments. Now with Son Montuno and Arsenio Rodríguez, his innovation, his idea to bring in that conga drum, he had to really be brave. He had to really face a lot of resistance to do this. But once that happened, the conga drum became an essential part of any ensemble. When people started to hear that beat, that tumbao rhythm, that interlocked with the other instruments, the bass and the piano and the guitars and the horns, this created such a unique sound that really took over the music scene that was happening in Cuba at the time. And that evolution from son to Son Montuno, adding the conga drum, adding more horns, into mambo, this is what would eventually translate and move again to New York, where you get that mambo craze and that golden era of salsa that incorporated Afro-Cuban jazz, that would bring that conga drum to the forefront of the music scene at the time. New York actually has a very important part to play in this history of the conga drum, because it was precisely in New York where that fusion of those Afro-Cuban genres of music started to mix and mingle and interchange within the jazz that was going on in New York at that time, in the 40s and the 50s. And a very important story happens between two people that met in these two different worlds, these Afro-Cuban world and the African-American jazz world. And the story goes like this. You know, in Cuba, the conga drum was being used more and more in different popular music, such as danzón mambo, such as cha-cha-cha, such as the mambo, etc. And a lot of people from Cuba were traveling to New York during this time and intertwining with the jazz world that was going on at the time in areas such as the Palladium Ballroom in New York, right? So you have these bands, for example, Tito Puente, you have Machito, you have Tito Rodríguez. These are big band style type of ensembles, right? That these were the band ensembles that were used for jazz. Now you have the combination of Afro-Cuban musicians coming into these big band orchestras, right? One of these people's name was Mario Bauza. And Mario Bauza was one of these Cuban musicians that would find his way into Cab Calloway's band. But the story really happens here when Mario Bauza suggests a conga drummer from Havana, Cuba, named Chano Pozo, to a jazz player named Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie was looking for someone to play one of those tom-toms, is what he called them, but what he really was referring to was the tumbadora. He was looking for somebody to play that in his band. Mario Bauza suggested Chano Pozo. Chano Pozo was a well-known conguero, was well-known at playing the tumbadora. He was in the main shows that were happening in Cuba, in the big cities at the time. So Chano Pozo met Dizzy Gillespie, and they formed some of the first Afro-Cuban jazz music, fusing bebop with Afro-Cuban genres of music. That fusion became some of the first Afro-Cuban jazz. Songs like Manteca. These different songs featured the conga tumbao up front, right? The conga tumbao was being featured in a more presentive way that really put that beat, that put that rhythm of the of the Congo Tumbao in front and center stage. And from that time on, from that fusion between the Afro-Cuban genres of music to the Afro-American jazz genres of music, the Congo Tumbao has never left. And as time started to develop and as salsa started to become popular in more of the late 60s and 70s, you cannot hear one band, Afro-Latin band, without a conga drum. Now, there's a very funny story that is related to the name conga that was given to this drum, and it has to do with the commercialization and the popularization of this rhythm and these drums and how they gained interest in other parts of the world, specifically in the US during the 50s, at this time when mambo was starting to be developed and starting to be created. These big bands were fusing this music. The story has to do with a lot of these rhythms when they would come into these new contexts like New York, they would get popularized sort of out of context. And this can be seen from the popularization of the rumba, but not the rumba that was played in Cuba. It was a different rumba that was popularized. Also the popularization of cha-cha-cha. This rhythm also became popular in rock. The popularization of mambo, which became the mambo craze in New York. One of these people that popularized these Afro-Cuban rhythms in New York was Desi Arnaz from the I Love Lucy show. And this is how the term conga was tagged on to these drums, is because of a little number that he would do with a drum that he had strapped around his neck, and he would do what we call a conga line. And this would be sort of like his finale act that would get the crowd to interact. And he would take the drum and create sort of like a train, a conga line with that rhythm, dum 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 da, dum 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 da. So a lot of the times that drum that he held around his neck, strapped to his neck, that he was playing, people started calling that the conga drum. When really conga is not referring to that drum specifically. The drum was called the tumbadora. The conga was something else that was done primarily in the eastern side of Cuba. It was those street comparsas, or those street parades or festivals that they would do in the neighborhood. Everybody had their own sort of neighborhood group of musicians where they would, in certain times of the year, they would parade through the streets playing instruments and dancing. This would be considered a conga, or a comparsa was more of the ones that included the floats and things like that. Sort of similar to what you might see in Mardi Gras or other types of festivals. Now, this is how that term conga got tagged onto these drums, right? And it was sort of a commercialized term. But this conga, this drum, exploded into the mainstream music in tremendous ways. And you can find these drums and this rhythm in funk. You can find it in rock. Bands use the conga drum like Santana. You can find it in world music. You can find it in Michael Jackson, Paul Simon. Artists all across genres have embraced the instrument's unique sound and have really incorporated this instrument into the modern day expression of music as a whole. So why should we care about any of this as dancers? Well, the reason why we should really care about the Conga Tumbao is because the Conga Tumbao can transform the way we move as Afro-Latin social dancers. When you're able to recognize the Tumbao rhythm, you start to hear the conversation that's happening between the music and the movement, right? You start to feel the space in between the beats. You start to learn how to phrase your dancing with the music instead of just stepping on numbers, right? This is why the musicality is increased. Your musicality tremendously increases when you're able to tune your ear and coordinate your body to the Conga Tumbao. And one way that you can really see how this works is with cha-cha-cha and the discrepancy of cha-cha-cha that happens. And a lot of times with new dancers who come into Afro-Latin social dancing, when they encounter cha-cha-cha, which became a very popular rhythm, they will dance cha-cha-cha on one timing instead of the on-two contratiempo timing that it was originally danced, right? So, for example, if you dance cha-cha-cha on one, then when the tumbao rhythm, which is in the cha-cha-cha, when it accents that shuffling, tu-tu, 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 you're supposed to shuffle along with that, right? But if you do your time step on one, it doesn't align with that conga tumbao. Now, if you shift it and you start to dance on the on-two timing, the contratiempo time step, then you can see how when the conga does tutu, your feet are shuffling on the same tutu, right? And this is the synchronization of the music and the movement. The same thing happens with learning mambo or any of the other contratiempo styles of Afro-Latin dances. When you're able to hear that conga tumbao is directly telling you when to step and how to connect to the rhythmic matrix of that specific song, right? So as a social dancer, especially as an Afro-Latin social dancer, your ability to tune your ear to the conga tumbao will give you the ability to dance onto timing, which will allow you to dance with many more dancers, right? Which allow you to dance to many more different genres of Afro-Latin music that require contratiempo time steps, right? Because the on-one time step really has been standardized in today's Afro-Latin social dances, but the on-one time step wasn't necessarily the traditional time step used. The traditional time step used is a contratiempo time step, meaning it's a syncopated time step that emphasizes the second beat rather than the first beat, right? And this all starts with our understanding of the tumbao and our ability to tune our ears to the tumbao within every salsa song that we hear. And no matter what salsa song it is, the tumbao exists because there is no salsa without the tumbao. The whole reason that salsa is existing is because of those foundational rhythms of the conga tumbao, the bass tumbao, the bongo, the tres or the montuno of the piano. All of these instrumental tumbaos are intersecting together to form that salsa beat that we know today as salsa, right? So to sum all of this up and to bring this to a conclusion, I would really encourage everyone to dive deep into more study about the conga. There's a lot that we didn't cover here. There's a lot of evolution of the conga drum that we didn't cover when it comes to the hardware that is used on the conga drum, how it changed from tuning the drum with fire, right? And now the conga drum is tuned with metal hardware. Also other contributions and evolutions when it comes to the technique of the conga drum, how it's played, how many conga drums are played. The evolution is fascinating, and the more you do your research, the more you look into this concept of the conga tumbao, the more you'll be amazed at what this heartbeat rhythm is and the power that it has to enhance our interpretation of the music through our movement. And if this episode resonated with you in any way, share it with somebody, with a dancer, a musician. Let's keep the conversation going. Interact with this podcast. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your feedback. If you want to keep diving deeper into Afro-Latin music and dance, make sure to subscribe to The Art of Tumbao for future episodes. Well, until the next time, keep dancing, keep shining, keep listening. Most importantly, keep feeling and embodying the rhythm. I'll see you next time.